Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. When it comes to disability inclusion and accessibility, many businesses don't know where to begin. Today, we're going to be talking about an organization working to change that. VisitAble is committed to helping organizations become more inclusive for everyone, from business clients and visitors to employees. VisitAble provides certifications that center on best practices, including advice and recommendations from experts in accessibility and individuals in the disability community. Joe Jamison, VisitAble's CEO and founder, gives us a lot of information about how this company is working to make businesses more welcoming and inclusive for everyone. Welcome back to the Assembly Inclusion podcast. Today, we're joined by Joe Jamison, founder of VisitAble. Joe, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Katie. I'm happy to be here.
So just to start off, can you tell us about the mission behind VisitAble and what actually inspired you to start the organization?
VisitAble was founded back in 2019. I was a college student at the University of Virginia. I was pursuing the entrepreneurship minor, and the capstone course for the minor was to create your own business. They asked us all to pick something that we're passionate about, and I knew at that point that I really wanted to do something personal to me, and that was to increase experiences or improve and enhance experiences for people with disabilities. And the reason behind that is my life experiences with my father, who has used a wheelchair my entire life, growing up beyond just the physical environment, which is graspable, right? The physical environment speaks for itself, and people can understand how someone that uses a wheelchair, how the physical environment affects them. But, I notice a lot of the interpersonal side of things as well. I noticed how people would ignore my father and speak only to me. I would see how people would ask questions that weren't relevant at all, which could potentially become intrusive. And I saw how people were using outdated and offensive verbiage or, things like slow down, speed racer, things like that. And at the end of the day, like these people that were saying these things or doing these things, they may have had the best intention in mind. They may have had the best customer service training or whatever it is, but you never know what you don't know. And really, no matter what's happening, whether the intentions are there or not, my family is still going to feel excluded and unwelcome at the end of the day. So VisitAble's really kind of started through that program and combined it with my personal passion experiences from my father, who has used a wheelchair my entire life. I went out in the Charlottesville downtown mall, started talking to a bunch of businesses and offering the whole gamut of everything I could think of. I think I started with accessibility assessments and reports with feedback specifically based on mobility, and because that's just what I knew. Pandemic forced me to expand my horizons, so I went out and earned a certified professional in accessibility core competency certificate, and that's through the International Association of Accessibility Professionals. I learned a lot more about all types of disabilities and then did surveys and focus groups. We expanded all of our offerings to encompass all types of disabilities. And most recently, we have decided to focus on what we think to be the most effective and the most scalable piece of how we started, which was disability awareness and inclusion training. From the start, we tried to create a motivation that's separate from ADA compliance, because this is a system that we thought that a lot of people think about compliance or disability in relation to compliance, which is very reactive and punitive in nature. From the start, we knew we wanted to have some positive or proactive way to think about disability. The fact that we kind of live in a capitalistic society, we thought that maybe a certification would be more or less a good way to do that, to create more positive differentiator that could help people capture a part of a market that's substantial and that they may not be currently catering to.
I definitely agree about the, desire to give people the training in a way that is proactive rather than reactive, like actually taking the initiative to do it, as opposed to, okay, here's another box to check. We have to say we did it and we did it, like actually making sure people, are interested and want to get that, as opposed to just, like you said, compliance. That's something We try to do that here too with our courses, try to make it so it's not just, oh, I have to go through another special education training. It's no, here's something that can actually improve the work that you're doing. So I wanted to talk about your training programs in general and the advocate certification. What are the requirements? I know you had mentioned there is training. What does a company have to do or a business have to do to achieve that level of certification?
I'll start with the training, which is the meat of the certificate, and I'll go to the certificate itself. So the training that we offer is a self-guided e-learning module. We update this yearly based on focus groups and surveys that we send out to all types of people with all types of disabilities. Within that training, we're trying to create a baseline disability awareness and inclusion training. So things like interpersonal best practices, accessibility best practices, industry-specific best practices, language, verbiage, just to name a few, and there's a bunch more as well. I think we just added intersectionality as well to help professionals. And this training is a self-guided e-learning module. We have two different versions. We have one that is 50 minutes long for those with decision-making power and those that are managers, because they have more of a say over policies, practices, procedures. And we also have a frontline training, which is around 30 to 35 minutes. And that's just for the more frontline staff that don't have as much time. We try to make that compacted and as efficient as possible with the content that we have. So that's what the training looks like. The actual certification itself, it's very important that we're very clear about this. This certification does not indicate accessibility. And I don't really think any certification should do that. It's almost like a conflict of interest if you do that, because people want to earn the certificate and they want to say they're certified through that. And then the company issuing the certificate wants to get more people certified. So we steer clear of that. We're very transparent about the certification. It means two things. There's two requirements. It means that an organization has trained 80% of their staff in an agreed upon timeframe, and that they have made their training part of the onboarding process for new employees. Ultimately, I think this shows a priority of that organization or location, that they have made this training and made disability inclusion, at least as an ideal, an organizational priority for all current and new employees.
I appreciate that you made that distinction between it's not that you're accessible and through the certification, but it shows that you are taking an initiative to learn more about and keep your employees up to date on the training related to disability. Because I get a lot of questions like that. Oh, how can I be like disability certified in this area? There's no like stamp. Yes, you are 100% accessible all the time. So I appreciate that you made that distinction.
I've had similar questions, and it's like, listen, that's not a thing. You could check the DOJ, like you could do all these things, but it just wouldn't make sense, So I try to be very transparent about that.
And you had mentioned some of the modules that you have within that training. So you had mentioned there is like the verbiage, the language. What were some of the other modules within that self-paced training that are included?
I think the secret sauce of our training, if you will, is the fact that we have genuine storytelling. So just like I introduced myself and you prompted the question, but regardless if you did or not, I was going to tell you my story and my passion with my dad, because I think it's important for people to understand where people are coming from and put a story behind a training or name. So that's always how we start with the founding story. We go into, a definition of disability inclusion. We go into some statistics for people to keep in mind about the importance and how relevant and prominent this audience and market potentially is for them. We talk about some big picture accessibility best practices, mistakes and assumptions that are commonly made, interaction. We do have a breakdown by disability. One comment on that: there is an infinite amount of ways to break down the types of disabilities. And I don't think there's necessarily one right answer. And we primarily do this just for digestibility. We do say in the training, and I'll say it right now, that, we're not trying to draw boundaries between different types of disabilities, because there's combinations, different levels of severity and variations. And we acknowledge that. Our breakdown, we did blind and low vision, deaf and hard of hearing, deaf blind, autism and neurodivergent, speech differences, non-apparent disabilities and mental health challenges, and mobility, body structure, and dexterity disabilities. So again, that's just the way that we did it. I've heard 1,000 ways to break it down, and that's just the way that we decided to do it. After that, we have industry-specific best practices. And at that point, we wrap up the training with, sources, additional resources, quiz, certificate of completion, that kind of thing.
Awesome. That's a really good breakdown of different activities and things like that too. I appreciate the comment you made about the different ways you can break down the type of disability. I always struggle with that too because I'm
Mhm.
education background, so people always tend to go like the IDEA. This is the classifications within that. Accommodations flip flop between different disabilities, and just because someone has this disability doesn't mean the accommodation works for them. So it's good that you mentioned that as well. I think that's really important to consider. And you had mentioned at the conclusion there is the training related to different industries. So how do you manage to balance? Because I'm assuming your clients and people who are into certification are within different types of businesses. So how do you manage to accommodate all the different industries and fields that exists within your training?
Great question. And I think that's a work in progress. We're still figuring out. I mean, the ideal situation for any business is to find product market fit. And then from there, be able to really focus on, a couple industries. And that's what we're working towards. But of course, and this is a good thing, people from outside those markets may reach out and want to learn more. Or there might just be something that comes up randomly, just like from networking or whatever. Sometimes I overcommit myself because I really want to make sure we have relevant content for people. Usually when we have like an onboarding call or email conversation, we're asking about like day-to-day functions and their responsibilities. And then we combine that with our knowledge on accessibility and then create like an industry specific best practices section. As we work more and more in a specific industry, our knowledge grows and we're able to apply like more specific industry best practices. But that is always like a work in progress, I think.
That makes a lot of sense because I mean that helps too, right? It makes it much more relevant for them to see like, oh, this is the field I'm working in day to day. I could totally see how this applies into what I'm doing on a daily basis. And you had mentioned too that you revise it on, I think you said a yearly basis too, to make sure that the information is the most up to date. So how do you stay current in terms of what, is best practices, what research is reflecting, or just even in general, how do you stay up to date on the evolving needs of the disability community?
The short answer is focus groups and surveys. So we do on a yearly basis where we're trying to send out some surveys through differentiated channels so we can reach people with different types of disabilities of different types of backgrounds and ages through trusted sources of theirs, such as like organizations that would have clients being people with disabilities or members or partners or whatever the case is. There's so many networks out there. There's so many voices that, want to be heard. So we do that on a yearly basis. The other things that we do are attending conferences as part of the upkeep of renewing the certification that I earned. And I think the last thing is just you'll be surprised at how much you learn on social media. I know it's not the best source, but I'm always keeping my eye peeled for like the trends, how people are talking, especially the polls. Those are really helpful. So like our company accounts, we follow like a bunch of thought leaders in the space. So we're basically just constantly monitoring that as well. But the surveys and the focus groups are like the main kind of data backed approach that we use for this because we want to share real voices and real experiences from people.
I love that you mentioned the social media because that's always my go-to answer for how to keep up to date on everything. For all the bad things it does a lot of good as well.
Yeah, those Twitter polls really are impressive, like are eye-opening at least. I think Twitter really people really speak out and really share a lot. I feel like it may be a little bit of response bias, a tiny bit, meaning like there may be people that speak out more, like sharing their opinions. So that's the one thing to keep in mind, which is why we want to like also diversify our input through the surveys and focus groups.
Yeah, that's a good point. You're varying where the information is coming from. So that works. So somebody who may not want to speak out online may be more inclined to in your survey or your focus group because it's kind of a smaller space for them to share their opinions. So that's great that you're doing a combination of all of those things to get your information. So, what improvements have you seen in businesses after they have taken your training and certification? I know it's probably difficult, obviously, to go in person and see all these businesses and what they are doing, but what have you heard as feedback from them in terms of how they think they've improved after your training?
I love that question. One thing that I'm going to try to do a better job at moving forward is really quantifying the responses and the feedback afterwards. That's always the hardest thing to get. So I will say, so the built environment stuff is probably the hardest to keep track of because we're not going there in person anymore, but also because it may take a budgeting cycle or so to actually make the change. One of my favorite responses from our training is we were working with a client and they had an employee come forth to them and say, this is the first time I felt included and seen as an employee as part of this organization's because you have offered this training program to us. That really made me feel like we were doing the right thing. And those kind of things help me wake up and keep going. And I'm talking about the training piece. I'll circle back to the physical, but we get people like sharing their certificates of completion online and talking about like, I'm neurodiverse myself, and this is extremely important. Organizations like these, like VisitAble, are working to create better experiences. Let's continue making positive momentum and progress. And then lastly, when we did do the assessments, that's when we could really see it because people would ask, I guess that's in general, assessments or training. People are going to be asking questions afterwards. I think that's how you can see people are genuine about this. They're like, oh, well, what about this? What if we were to do this? We love to hear questions. That's how we can see people are going to be making changes. When we did assessments, though, we'd have people asking us to come back and like assess new spaces. And we started with like websites, listings of accessibility information, like a database. So we had people wanting to update that. We have people asking for specific lists of resources for who they can reach out to based on our suggestions. So that's always a good sign. And that's just a couple. I think there's definitely a lot of room for improvement of seeing how to quantify the actual like success and impact that's being made, not only to the physical space, but also to like how the employee feels, the good experiences and interactions they're having, and kind of hopefully some good reviews that they're getting, and also how confident they feel on their end and prepared to provide a good experience.
Those are some good examples of how, people have clearly benefited from the training so far, especially the employee example. I mean, because I'm sure the training is initially focused on making sure that your customers coming into your business also feel included, but people often forget about the employees that are working in their actual, businesses. That's great that someone felt seen and included by having that type of training offered to them.
It is a constant reminder because that's what everyone assumes. It's just for the visitor and customer at first. And it's like, well, you have employees too, right? Like disabled people are in the workforce, right? And having this as a cultural thing, it's not just a customer facing thing. It's an employee culture. And back at the beginning of the call, when I was talking about the certification piece, it's about making it an organizational priority, not just for the front line, but for all the organization.
And I could see how that would make an employee feel more accepted and included within the space. I've heard from people, even, past guests on here, I've mentioned like, oh, people say, I don't have people with disabilities working for me. And they're like, well, you probably do. And maybe they just don't feel comfortable enough sharing, or they just don't want to share. But something like this could open up the conversation then and help somebody feel more included when maybe they didn't before. So that's really great that that's kind of been happening with the training. So, looking forward, what are some future goals you have for VisitAble? How do you envision the organization continuing to grow and make a positive change within businesses around the world?
I think three big things to note. One, we just really want to be able to focus more, I think. The more we can get into specific industries and like really see a good fit, which is a process, but the more we can find that product market fit and which industries one need us the most, but at the same time want the training, which is the tricky part sometimes, is finding the perfect combination between the two. We can really just dive in and like just commit ourselves to that type of content, which is going to make it much more, helpful and relevant and digestible. The second thing is like being able to create a suite of trainings, because right now we have basically the baseline training, and that's what we do. It's a baseline training. We're trying to reach the most people possible to instill a baseline awareness and knowledge within them about disability inclusion. Eventually, it'd be nice to dive more into specific types of disabilities and specific types of situations, and then different combinations of those things. I think would be ultimately a great goal. I want to be able to partner with other disability organizations as well and figure out how we can work well together, maybe amplifying their voices or whatever the case may be. And lastly, I want VisitAble to be seen as a safe and representative, genuine kind of self-advocacy through training organization, meaning hiring people with disabilities, having people with disabilities consistently being in surveys and focus groups and being in our training, and having actors, that have disabilities within our trainings and models and that kind of thing as a consistent opportunity generator, and be able to create jobs from that would be an awesome goal. And then eventually, I feel like this is a common general answer, but being able to expand beyond the US would be great too. I'm happy that you use the word disability inclusion as well. I think it's a great one. But the world could use that, especially if there's not an ADA. So I think that's also a big goal of ours.
I appreciate the focus that you have on wanting to continue to expand on amplifying the voices of the disability community and also eventually hiring. I think that's really great and important. I look forward to seeing, what happens, and I'll keep following what's going on with VisitAble to see all the progress that's being made. My last question is kind of a broad one, but what message or advice do you have for businesses and organizations who are looking to create a more accessible and welcoming environment?
I think 4 words: listen and don't assume. I think, because everyone's different, everyone has different preferences and needed accommodations, being able to listen to your local disabled community, bring them to the table so they can be involved and give you feedback and advice on your location, your organizations, policies, practices, procedures, how you do things, and the decisions that you make. And also not assuming. So, if you have an assumption or preconception in the back of your mind while you're listening, that makes that listening not as effective or impactful. So being able to really just clear your mind of all assumptions. You never know who has a disability, who doesn't. You never know whose family member has a disability, who doesn't. You never know if people are, struggling to do certain things or maybe frustrated about certain things. So it's always important to come to the table with a fresh mind, with an open mind, and be able to listen to the people that actually are the real experts, the people with the disabilities themselves.
I think that's really solid advice. I think that people need to consider when they're, looking to make those changes. Because so often people come in with this idea of what they want to do, and they're like, okay, you need to do this, this, and this. And it's like, but did you ask anybody if that's what they want to have done? Or a variety of people, even better. So I think that's great advice for people moving forward.
People are sometimes just planning out their own, going about their own thing, doing what they think is best. And there's a saying, like a smart person in the room. You want to find someone who has been through this before many times successfully, ideally. And then from there, be able to use that to inform your decisions. And I think there's no better person to engage than your local disability community who may be going to your establishment or could be going to your establishment the most.
Oh yeah. You want to hear from the people who are actually experiencing it. And I was guilty of that too. When I was in the classroom teaching, I would do something and I'd be like, no, this is what we have to do. This is how it has to be done. And my students would be telling me like, no, that's not working for us. Here's what you need to do. And I'm like, you know what? Like, now we're going to start planning things together because you have a better insight into how you learn than I do right now. So let's plan it together. So that's great advice, I think, going forward, that people need to listen and not assume. That's great advice. And I want to thank you so much, Joe, for being here with us today and talking to us about VisitAble and all the great work being done. I'm going to make sure to link the website in the show notes so anybody listening can take a look at it. But thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you, Katie. It was a pleasure being here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.